Well, today we are going to be continuing in Mark chapter 6, and this story is the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So, a story I think is somewhat familiar to many of us, but if you'd like to grab your Bible, or you can consult the screen behind me, and we're going to be looking today at verses 30 through 44 from Mark chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. This text is loaded. There's a lot going on here, so let's dive in. Mark writes, "The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. And he said to them, 'Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and find some rest.' So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him and said, 'This is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.' But he answered, 'You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give them something to eat?' 'How many loaves do you have?' he asked. 'Go and see.' When they found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all of the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the fish among them. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Amen. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, to start, let me give a brief word about the context of this passage. Immediately before this text in Mark chapter 6, we had this sort of brief side story where Mark writes about Herod and John the Baptist, and for the first time in his gospel, he departs from the story of Jesus. And if you happen to miss that sermon last week, you can catch up on any of the sermons on our church social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Spotify, all of that, if you'd like to catch up on those. But after that story, sort of a strange little account there of Herod and John the Baptist, after that, Mark then comes right back to the story of Jesus, and that's where we pick up today. And so, to take a look at verse 30, tells us the apostles gathered around Jesus and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And so this is kind of the rest of the context. Before that episode with Herod and John the Baptist, if you remember, Jesus sent his disciples out 2 by 2 on a mission trip. So this was the first time he had sent them out, and he sent them out with his authority to do ministry, to teach, to heal, to cast out demons. And so they've gone out to do this, and now they've come back. And they returned to Jesus, and they're reporting to him everything that they had done and everything that they had seen and learned and experienced. And so today we're basically picking right back up where we left off from that story. Then we look at verse 31. It says, so they've come back to Jesus. They're telling Jesus about their mission trip. And verse 31, then because there were so many people coming and going, they didn't even have a chance to eat. And Jesus said, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So this is a pattern. We've seen this pattern. It's established throughout the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus will go through kind of an intense period of ministry, right? He's been teaching, or he's been healing, or maybe he's even been casting out demons. We've seen him calm a storm and raise a little girl from the dead. And after an intense period of ministry, what Jesus often does is he withdraws. He goes to rest. He goes to pray. He goes to spend time with the Father. And here he's encouraging the disciples to do the same. And he's also kind of setting up what's to come here, because in verse 31, he says, Come to a quiet place, get some rest, because they didn't even have a chance to eat. Right? Have you ever been so busy you didn't have a chance to eat? So that's how they were. Some of us maybe need those chances, but here they were so busy they hadn't had a chance to eat. They're hungry. They haven't had any downtime, and then this kind of begins to set the tone for what's to come in this larger story of the feeding of the 5,000. Verse 32. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. So they do it. They take off. They take off to go somewhere else to rest, to get away from the crowds. This says a solitary place. Some versions in English will say like a desolate place. So they were really trying to get away. In verse 33, many of them saw, many in the crowd, they saw them leaving, and they recognized them, and then they ran on foot from all the towns and villages, and then they get to the desolate place before Jesus and the disciples in their boat. So I think the idea is kind of like on the Sea of Galilee there. People are on the shore, and it's small enough, it's contained enough that they can kind of see where the boat with Jesus and his disciples is. They can see where it's headed. And so they just run along the shore. And I guess they were fast runners. They run along the shore. They get to the place before Jesus and the disciples there. And so many saw them. They recognized them. They go ahead. Verse 34, when Jesus landed, he saw this large crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began teaching them many things. So, of course, as this is going on, it's interesting. The crowd, when Jesus and his disciples leave in the boat, the crowd, it's not just for Jesus that they're running ahead to go to where Jesus and his disciples are going. It's on account of them. The disciples are now kind of lumped in with the ministry of Jesus. They have been out doing what Jesus does. And so people see them and they run ahead to get with them. But then there's a change, and I think this is really fascinating. There's this change from verse 33 to verse 34. In verse 33, the people recognized them. They saw them. They ran ahead on foot to get ahead of them. And then in verse 34, it changes. It changes, and we see he went ashore. He saw the great crowd. He had compassion on them. So there's a change there. They recognize the disciples. They associate the disciples with Jesus, but then something changes. It's only Jesus, it seems, who gets out of the boat, right? It's only Jesus who sees the crowd with compassion. It's only Jesus who notices them as sheep. Now this phrase, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Many of you ever heard that kind of language in the Bible, maybe in the Old Testament? Right? This is a very common way that God's people are talked about as being sheep. I mean, Psalm 23, Psalm 74, Psalm 78, Ezekiel 34, and others. We see God's people talked about as, or identified as sheep, and that he's the shepherd, right? So this is not a new concept that Jesus is using here. This is really Old Testament stuff. And Jesus looks at the crowd. He sees them as sheep without a shepherd. And then the text says he had compassion on them. And this word compassion, really what this means is it's describing like a compassion that wells up from deep within a person. Like from the bowels of compassion, if you will. He really had this deep compassion and care or pity for the people there, right? Jesus sees this crowd and he sees that they need him and he knows that they need him. And so he begins to teach them many things. Verse 35. By this time it was late in the day. So his disciples come to Jesus. They say, this is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. A couple of things to keep our eyes on here. One, it seems here, Jesus got out of the boat. He saw the people. He was in the crowd. He had compassion on them. Now it seems that the disciples come to him. It's them again. It kind of implies they weren't with him up into this point. Maybe they had stayed in the boat. Maybe they had just kind of gone off somewhere away from the crowd to rest. They were exhausted from the ministry that they had been doing. Maybe they just took a nap, right? I mean, sometimes we just need to take a nap, and that might have been what they were doing, but whatever they were doing, at this point, they've had enough. And they know it's growing late. And they recognize that they are in the middle of nowhere. And, they're ready for this teaching to end. And they're ready to have their time with Jesus. And they say, send the people away, right? Let them go off somewhere and find something to eat. And then Jesus' response is so poignant here in verse 37. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. Again, a couple of things going on here. We have to wonder, how much of this is actually about food? I mean, obviously, at some level, this is definitely about food. But in Mark's gospel, there's often the thing behind the thing. And so obviously on some level this is about food, but I wonder how much of this is not about food, that there is something that they are hungry for, and the shepherd has recognized this in his people, and the disciples have not. And so, despite the fact that the disciples have just been on this amazing mission trip, they've been doing the works of Jesus, at this time, they can just not bring themselves to have this compassion. And they just can't see giving themselves away in this moment. And maybe you've been at a time like that. Maybe you've been serving or working or in some kind of ministry or mission, and you're just exhausted. And you need to recharge, and you just can't see giving yourself away anymore at that moment. And that's kind of where the disciples are, right? And so Jesus tells the disciples, you give them something to eat. And then they respond in verse 37. They say that would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that kind of money on bread and give it to them to eat? And here they're really pushing back. They're kind of talking back to Jesus. They're saying, this is an absurd amount of money it would take to feed these people. And, is that what you want us to go and do? But Jesus responds like this in verse 38. He asks them a question. This is a frequent way that Jesus responds in the Gospels, as he responds with questions. And he asks them, how many loaves do you have? And he said, go and see. And they went and they saw and they found out. And they said, well, there's 5 loaves and 2 fish. So apparently this crowd did not come well prepared at all. 5 loaves and 2 fish among them. And then I love what Jesus does here. The disciples are tired. The disciples are exhausted. They want to be alone with Jesus. They find themselves in this crowd that they don't even want to be in. And Jesus then in verse 38, in his mercy and in his grace, he invites them in. He wants to include them in this adventure of ministry that's about to happen, right? Go and see. How many loaves are there? How many fish might there be? Well, there's 5 and there's 5 and there's 2. It doesn't seem like much. But Jesus, he is not disturbed by the lack, because that's nothing to him. But he invites the disciples, he continues to invite them into ministry. Verse 39, he then directs the disciples to have all of the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. This has Old Testament fingerprints all over it. Back to the Exodus, back to Exodus 18, when Moses organized the people in the wilderness into groups of hundreds and 50s. Now, why did he do that? Moses did that so that he could take care of the people. It was too chaotic to take care of the people if they weren't organized, and so he organizes them in that way. And Jesus here is doing that again. He is organizing the people in order that he might take care of them. Just as God did it in the wilderness, Jesus is doing it now in this desolate place. And then verse 41, Jesus then taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves and he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And he also divided the fish among them. And again, this points us back to the Old Testament, and it points us back to the Exodus, where manna, the bread for God's people, came from heaven. And just as God provided everything that his people needed in the wilderness, so here Jesus is providing everything that his people need in this desolate place with this bread from heaven. And then the last 3 verses, they all ate and they were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. And the number of men who had eaten was 5,000. There's a lot going on in just those 3 verses. But to look at a couple of details here, Mark tells us in verse 44, that last verse, he says, the number of men who had eaten was 5,000. That language is important because the word here for men is not a generic term like mankind or like all people. This is a very specifically talking about heads of households. And so scholars or commentators believe that, if you look at a household, maybe it's mom and 1 or 2 kids. Scholars believe it very much could have been like 15 to 20,000 people there in that crowd in this desolate place. I mean, a huge crowd in this place, right? And verse 42 tells us, in spite of the size of this crowd, many more than just 5,000, it says they all ate and they all were satisfied. There was enough food for everybody. Now, just to think about some of the symbolism that comes through these verses, back in verse 38, it talks about the amount of food that they had, right? 5 loaves and 2 fish. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but 5 plus 2 is 7, right? In the Bible, 7 is kind of a symbolic number for completeness. So it says they ate and they were satisfied. It's like they were made whole. They were made complete by this bread from heaven. Everything that the crowd needed was given here by Jesus. Everything and even more. And also, the bread, this text tells us the bread was broken. And this is a foreshadowing. It's a foreshadowing of Jesus, the bread of life, who would be broken. And in doing so, he would give us everything we needed and even more. Further, I don't think it's insignificant that there were 12 basketfuls of broken bread and fish left over. 12 baskets. One for each of the tribes of Israel, symbolizing the entirety of the people of God. So we see that in Jesus, there is more than enough to satisfy even all of God's people. And here in this text, we see Jesus reconstituting God's people. He is reinterpreting that moment in Exodus where Moses divides his people and where God provides manna, bread from heaven for his people. And Jesus is doing it here once again. And he's saying, I am now the terms by which God's people are organized, by which God's people are gathered, by which everything that is necessary is given to God's people so that they are complete. I'm setting the terms for the kingdom of God. And those terms are going to be around my body, which is broken for you. Finally, a few quick takeaways before we finish up. With the disciples had kind of a grumpy attitude in this episode, right? Maybe some of us sometimes have grumpy attitudes when it comes to ministry. I know I do. Even so, Jesus still invited his disciples into this adventure. He included them in the dividing up of his people, in the distributing of bread and fish, and the collecting up of the leftovers, those 12 baskets. And I think one of the takeaways of that for me is that even sometimes when we're grumpy, even when sometimes we just don't get it, that Jesus still includes us and invites us into ministry. Also, there was an abundance. Not only did these thousands of people eat, but they were full. They were satisfied. So, this is a reminder that God gives us everything that we need and even more in Jesus.